My name is Rowan Calloway. I'm 46 years old, and I've spent the better part of 2 decades learning that the most dangerous people in a room are the ones who smile the widest. My wife, Simone, had a beautiful smile. I know how industry galas work. I've attended hundreds of them. Fundraisers, shareholder dinners, product launches, the kind of evenings where everyone is performing a version of themselves they want the world to believe. The lighting is strategic. The open bar is calculated. The applause is almost always for the wrong person. But I had never walked out of a room the way I walked out of the Aldwyn Grand Ballroom on a Friday night in March. No slammed door, no raised voice, not a single word spoken. I simply stood up, straightened my jacket, and left. Quietly, completely, precisely on schedule. Simone was still at the podium when I reached the exit. I could hear the applause rising behind me like a tide. 300 people celebrating a woman they believed had conquered everything alone. Including, apparently, me. Let me tell you how we got there. Simone Voss was 34 when I met her at a clean energy conference in Denver. She had an idea, genuinely brilliant, almost fully formed, for a molecular filtration process that could reduce industrial water contamination at a fraction of the current cost. She was presenting it to a room of 12 people, half of whom were checking their phones. I was the only one taking notes. We talked for 3 hours afterward. About the science. About the market. About what it would take to turn a research paper into a company. She was sharp, passionate, and funny, in that dry, precise way that suggested she'd spent more time in labs than at dinner parties. By the time we said goodnight, I already knew 2 things. Her idea was worth building, and I wanted to be the one standing next to her when she built it. We got married 2 years later. Viridia Environmental Sciences was incorporated 6 months after that. What Simone presented to the world, and what she came to present to herself, was the story of a self-made founder who had transformed a doctoral thesis into a $90 million company through sheer will and vision. That story was partly true. Her science was real, her drive was real, her talent was undeniable. What got quietly edited out of the story was everything else. The $2.3 million in seed funding that came from my family's investment vehicle, Callaway Capital Partners. The entity Simone had stopped mentioning in interviews because it, quote, complicated the narrative. The Series B bridge loan I personally guaranteed 14 months ago, $14 million, because Viridia's institutional investors were skittish after a delayed FDA review and Simone needed to make payroll. She'd asked me on a Tuesday evening, voice tight, eyes not quite meeting mine. I signed the paperwork on Wednesday morning without a single condition. And then there was the patent. Viridia's core technology, the molecular filtration process that every contract, every partnership, every valuation was built on, had been filed under a holding company called Halcyon IP Trust, my holding company. Simone had signed a licensing agreement in year 2 of the business, when we were still eating dinner together and finishing each other's sentences. She'd handed it back without reading page 4. The page that specified the license was personal, non-transferable, and revocable upon 30 days, written notice. She was too busy to read documents back then. She trusted me. It's remarkable how people stop reading things carefully once they stop believing the other person could ever actually use them. The first sign that something had shifted wasn't the late nights. Those I understood. Simone was building something real, and real things demand real hours. It wasn't even the distance, the way a marriage can quietly depressurize, like a slow leak in a tire, so gradual you don't notice until you're stranded somewhere unfamiliar. It was the way she stopped saying we. She used to say it constantly. We're raising the next round, we're presenting at the Geneva Summit, we're repositioning the brand. 6 months ago, the we disappeared without announcement. Replaced by I and my and the company, as though the last decade of shared sacrifice had been quietly reclassified. The shift happened around the time Viridia brought on Dennis Farrow as Chief Revenue Officer. Dennis was 49, twice divorced, the kind of man whose confidence comes specifically from rooms full of people who can't afford to disagree with him. He wore his authority the way some men wear cologne, aggressively, and without apparent awareness of how it landed on others. I met him at the company's annual retreat in October and spent 11 minutes talking to him before identifying the specific category of person he was, the kind who mistakes proximity to power for power itself. The late nights multiplied. Simone's explanations became more polished and less specific. Dennis wants me to lead the market expansion personally. He says no one else understands the technology the way I do. That last part was true, at least. But understanding and being understood by are different things entirely. I started noticing the receipts. Restaurant charges for places I'd never been invited to. A hotel stay in Boston on a night she'd told me she was in Chicago. The phone, always face down now, always within arm's reach, password updated in November. When I mentioned it, she gave me that patient, slightly tired smile. Rowan, I handle sensitive investor relationships. We all updated our security protocols. Plausible. Professional. The architecture of a lie built by someone who'd spent years in boardrooms learning to construct things that could withstand pressure. The confirmation came in January. I'd come home early from a client engagement, and I heard her voice from the study, low and careful, the register people use when they think the house is empty. He won't make a scene, she was saying. That's not who he is. When the time is right, I'll handle it cleanly. A pause, then a soft laugh. No. He still thinks this is a partnership. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I walked to my office, sat down, and opened my laptop. Not to spiral, not to confront, to plan. I called Yvonne Hartley the following morning. She's a corporate attorney I'd worked with years before Viridia existed. Methodical, unsentimental, the kind of lawyer who reads every page of every document and has an inconvenient memory for details. When I explained the situation, she was quiet for several seconds. Rowan, she said finally, you've structured this very carefully. I structured it for a marriage, I replied. I'm restructuring it for what's actually happening. Over the next 8 weeks, Yvonne and I reviewed everything. Every document Simone had signed. Every term in the Halcyon IP license. Every clause in the bridge loan guarantee. Every provision in the prenuptial agreement Simone had considered a formality, and I had considered a foundation. Simultaneously, I had quiet conversations with 2 of Viridia's 5 board members. Gordon Achebe, the independent director who'd grown increasingly uneasy about the company's governance since Dennis arrived, and Priya Nambiar, the venture partner who'd backed Viridia's Series A and had seen her concerns about financial controls repeatedly dismissed. I wasn't recruiting them against Simone. I was showing them documents and letting them draw their own conclusions. Gordon called me back after 48 hours. The expense irregularities you flagged. I had noticed some of that, but I didn't have the full picture. How long has this been happening? Long enough, I said. By mid-February, I had everything I needed. Legal standing, board alignment, documentation. And one thing more important than all of it, patience. The gala had been on the calendar for months. Viridia's annual fundraiser, the company's biggest visibility event of the year. 300 investors, partners, and industry leaders. The kind of room Simone had spent a decade learning to command. I decided it was the right place to let consequences arrive. The Aldwyn Grand Ballroom was everything a fundraiser aspires to be. Warm lighting, round tables dressed in white linen, the comfortable sound of people with money talking to other people with money. I arrived with Simone, sat beside her through dinner, made conversation with the couple to my left, drank half a glass of wine, and waited. Simone took the stage at 8:47 p.m. She looked exactly as I'd known her to look at events like this, composed, radiant, entirely in her element, the kind of woman a room naturally orients toward. She thanked the board, thanked the team, thanked the investors. Each acknowledgement was precise, the way a surgeon's movements are precise. Nothing wasted. And then she paused. Someone once told me that great founders are made by their circumstances, she said. I've been thinking about that lately. Because I want to be honest with you all tonight. A smaller smile. My circumstances have not always been easy. I built this company, this team, this technology, this future, in spite of obstacles, in spite of doubt. And yes, in spite of a husband who thought my ambitions were too large and my vision too ambitious. A beat. The audience was very still. I built this life despite him, and I'd do it the same way again. The applause came immediately. Not polite applause, not uncertain applause. Real, generous, 300-person applause, the kind that fills a ballroom and tells a person exactly what they want to hear. I sat with it for a moment. I looked around the table at the faces of people I had, in some cases known for years. Every single one of them was clapping. Then I reached for my jacket, folded my napkin on the table, and stood up. No scene, No words. I caught Gordon's eye across the room and gave him a single nod. He looked down at his phone. I walked out. The car was waiting. My driver, Tobias, had instructions from that morning. I sat in the back seat and opened my phone. 2 emails were drafted and waiting. I reviewed them once more, not because I needed to, but because I believe in being certain before being permanent. The first went to Callaway Capital Partners with instructions to formally call the bridge loan guarantee. Per the terms Simone had signed, a payment demand triggered a 72-hour cure window. Viridia didn't have $14 million in liquid reserves. Everyone at that board level knew it. The second was addressed to Viridia's board of directors and Simone personally. Formal notice of intent to terminate the Halcyon IP licensing agreement in 30 days, pending satisfactory resolution of outstanding governance concerns. I sent them at 9:03 p.m. My phone rang at 9:11. It was Priya Nambiar. Rowan, her voice was careful. The board is getting notifications. Is this happening tonight? Yes. A pause. Should I tell you what she just said at the podium? I was there, I said. I heard it. Another pause. Longer. I see. What do you need from us? An emergency board session, Monday morning, 9 o'clock. You'll have it. Inside the ballroom, I later learned, Simone's phone had buzzed while she was still accepting congratulations. Then again. Then Dennis Farrow had pushed through the crowd toward her, his face doing something it apparently didn't usually do, and she'd looked down at her screen and read 2 emails that rewrote the night entirely. By the time she looked up, I was already gone. The following 72 hours were, by any measure, extraordinary. Viridia's legal team called Yvonne on Saturday morning. Their tone was aggressive for approximately 20 minutes, until Yvonne walked them through the Halcyon IP licensing agreement clause by clause. After that, their tone shifted to something more closely resembling recognition of a difficult reality. Dennis Farrow sent me a text message on Saturday afternoon. It read, "We should talk. This doesn't have to be adversarial. I showed it to Yvonne. She advised me not to respond. I didn't." Simone called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to have that conversation in the back of a car or standing in my kitchen. That conversation deserved a proper setting. It would get one. Gordon and Priya spent the weekend reviewing the financial irregularities I'd flagged. Specifically, $340,000 in discretionary expenses over 18 months that had bypassed normal approval channels and appeared, based on documentation I'd provided, to have funded elements of Simone and Dennis's personal relationship. Hotel rooms in 3 cities. Dinners at restaurants Viridia had no business relationship with. Conference registrations for events neither of them had apparently attended. By Sunday evening, Gordon sent me a message. "The board is aligned. Monday is going to be consequential." I replied, "That's the intention." The boardroom was on the 19th floor of Viridia's offices, a glass-walled room with a view of the river that Simone had specifically chosen because she believed the view projected strength. I arrived at 8:45 in a navy suit I'd once worn to the closing of a deal that had made both of us very comfortable for a long time. Simone was already there when I entered. She looked like someone who had not slept. The composure that had defined her in public for years was present but thin, the way a structural wall looks fine until you notice the hairline crack running from floor to ceiling. She watched me sit down across from her without speaking. Dennis was not present. His resignation had been emailed to the board chair at 6 a.m. that morning. He apparently had enough experience with HR processes to understand which side of this calculation he was on. Gordon called the meeting to order. Priya sat to his right. The other 2 independent directors, both of whom I'd met privately in the preceding weeks, were seated and grave. "This emergency session has been called," Gordon said, "to address 3 items. First, the notice of IP license termination filed by Halcyon Trust, whose controlling party is Rowan Callaway. Second, the bridge loan payment demand filed by Callaway Capital Partners. Third, the governance and financial control concerns raised in the documentation distributed to this board on February 14th. He looked at Simone directly. "Simone, you've had 72 hours to prepare a response. The floor is yours." What followed was 25 minutes that I will remember for a long time, not with satisfaction, exactly, but with a particular kind of clarity, Simone was brilliant even then. She reframed, she contextualized. She argued the IP license terms were subject to reasonable interpretation, and that the bridge loan call was a breach of marital good faith actionable in divorce proceedings. She was persuasive the way she had always been persuasive. But Gordon had read the documents. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, "Simone, on the expense irregularities, do you dispute the documentation?" A long silence. "No," she said finally, "I don't dispute it." The vote to place her on administrative leave pending a formal investigation took 9 minutes. 4 in favor, 1 abstention, and Simone herself, who declined to vote and sat very still while it happened. After the vote, Gordon looked at me. "Rowan, what do you want for the company?" "The same thing I've always wanted," I said, "for it to be run properly, by people who deserve the trust that's been placed in them." I paused. "I'm willing to convert the bridge loan to a restructured equity position and negotiate a new IP licensing arrangement that protects the company's operations, on the condition that governance reform is immediate and documented. I'm not here to burn this down. It's built on real science done by real people. They don't deserve to lose their livelihoods because leadership lost its way." Bria had set her pen down somewhere in the middle of that. She looked at me for a long moment. "You've been planning this for a while." "Preparing," I said. "There's a difference." Simone was waiting in the hallway when I came out. She didn't look angry. She looked like someone who had been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time, and had finally, irreversibly, put it down. "The things I said at the gala," she started. "I know what you said. I need you to understand that Simone, I said it gently, not cruelly, just firmly. You said I was an obstacle you had to overcome. You said it in front of 300 people who have known both of us for years. You said it on purpose, because you believed it. That's not a misstatement you can walk back." She looked down. "I got lost," she said quietly, "in the ambition. In the narrative I'd built, I started believing my own version of the story. I did know, that part was true. But the story you told yourself required making me into something I wasn't. And that required lying. About the company, about us, about what you wanted from our marriage." I paused. "Did you ever actually want what you said you wanted, the life we talked about?" The question sat between us. She didn't answer it. That, too, was an answer. "Yvonne will be in touch about the divorce filing," I said. "The terms are fair. I've been careful about that. Rowan, take care of yourself, Simone." I meant it. Whatever she'd become, whatever choices she'd made, I had no appetite for her suffering. I just had no appetite for continuing to be the person she defined herself against. You're genuinely talented. Figure out what you want to build that actually belongs to you. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and didn't look back. 6 weeks after the hearing, I received a letter. No return address. Handwritten, forwarded from my attorney's office, by a mutual contact I recognized as Felix Okafor, a former Viridia engineer who'd left the company the previous year under circumstances he'd described at the time as irreconcilable differences with leadership. Inside was a single page, a printed email thread between Simone and Dennis from 8 months earlier. I almost didn't read it. I'd committed to facing reality fully, but I also knew there was a version of this where additional information just re-inflicted the same wound from a different angle. I read it. The thread was about a conversation Simone and Dennis had apparently had regarding the direction of the company, and specifically regarding me. "He'll stay quiet," Simone had written. "He's not built for confrontation. He'll give me everything I ask for because that's who he is." And then, 2 messages later, "The moment the Series C closes, we restructure his involvement and move forward. He won't fight it. He's too decent to fight it." Too decent to fight it. I sat with that for a while. Then I called Yvonne. "I have additional documentation for the divorce filing." "What kind?" "Evidence of premeditated plan to remove me from financial arrangements Simone had represented as jointly held. It goes to intent." "That's significant, Rowan." "Combined with everything else," she paused. "How are you holding up?" "Fine," I said. And I meant it. In the specific way you mean it, when you've already processed the hardest part, and what remains is just the paperwork. Every truth that comes out makes it easier to close the chapter. "That's healthy," she said. "Some people in your position would spiral." "I know," I replied. She counted on that. The business press picked up the story within a week of the board session. Viridia Environmental Sciences undergoes governance restructuring amid leadership transition. The language was careful and corporate. But the tech and clean energy communities are smaller than they appear, and within 10 days, the real story was circulating. The gala speech, the board vote, the IP license, the bridge loan. The husband who had quietly built the financial architecture his wife had been standing on while publicly describing him as dead weight. I didn't speak to journalists, I didn't post on LinkedIn, I made no statements of any kind. I didn't need to. Simone's professional network, so carefully cultivated over a decade, underwent a quiet and significant reorganization. Not because anyone attacked her, but because the industry doesn't reward the specific combination of qualities her story revealed. The ones who stayed were genuine, which turned out to be fewer than she'd assumed. She reached out once more, 3 weeks later, through her attorney. Not about the divorce terms. Those had been accepted essentially as filed, but a personal note her attorney had explained that she wanted me to have. I read it. It said, "I told myself a story where I was the only real person in it. I'm working on understanding what that cost." And then, "I know you don't need to hear this, but I'm saying it anyway, because I owe you honesty, even if it's years too late." I kept the note, not out of unresolved feeling, more because it was the most honest thing she'd said to me in a long time, and honest things deserve to be preserved. 14 months after the gala, I was standing in the conference room of a clean energy investment consortium I'd joined as a founding partner. The window overlooked a stretch of the harbor, and in the early morning light the water had that particular quality it gets in spring, like the surface is deciding whether to be still or move. Viridia had stabilized under an interim CEO, a quiet, competent woman named Audrey Yuen, who'd come from outside the industry and cared more about the science than the perception. The restructured IP licensing arrangement was generating licensing revenue. The bridge loan had been converted to equity at terms that made mathematical sense. The real technology, the thing that had always mattered, was still functioning in the world. I donated a significant portion of my liquidity to 2 foundations, one supporting research access for first-generation scientists, one funding water purification infrastructure in underserved communities, work that connected to Viridia's original mission without requiring me to remain attached to Viridia's story. Felix had sent me a message the previous week. "Heard you're building something new. The right people are paying attention." He'd included a name and a phone number. "She runs a climate tech fund. Brilliant. Rigorous. Doesn't confuse performance with substance. I think you'd find the conversation worthwhile." I'd looked at the message for a long time. Then I'd typed back, "Set up the call." Maybe it was progress. A year ago, I'd have built the walls too high and called it wisdom. Now I was willing to consider that being careful and being open weren't actually opposites. That you could carry the lessons of a damage without carrying the damage itself. I looked out at the harbor. The man I'd been on the night of the gala, the one who'd sat quietly at a linen-covered table and listened to his wife rewrite their shared history in front of 300 people, had believed that staying calm was the same as being passive. That decency meant absorbing whatever was directed at you and calling the bruises grace. He was gone. The man standing at the window had learned something different. That decency wasn't passivity. That preparation wasn't coldness. That walking quietly out of a room could be the most powerful thing a person did in a decade if they'd already done the work before they stood up. Simone had wanted to be seen as someone who'd built everything herself. What she hadn't accounted for was that I'd spent years genuinely, wholeheartedly helping her build it, and that a person who helps build something usually understands how it works. She was right that I wasn't built for confrontation. I was built for something longer, quieter, more certain. She'd called it a weakness. She was wrong about that, too. My phone lit up with a calendar notification. The call was in 20 minutes. I straightened my jacket, picked up my coffee, and walked toward the future with both hands free. That, I was learning, was what it felt like to have nothing left to carry.